So what we're looking for here is the forces acting at A and C. Does that make sense to everybody? Now this is a triangle, so what does that mean? It's fixed, so it's exerting both horizontal and vertical force. Circle, in this case, is just going to be exerting it's a roller, so it's going to be exerting a horizontal force. So at A, what forces do you think are going to be exerted? Up or down? Probably up, right? So I'm going to call that FAY. And do you think it's going to be pushing to the right or to the left? Left? So we said, and we'll call that FAX. And what about C? Do you think that's pointing to the left or to the right? To the right? Right there. So that's going to be FCX. Everybody understand how that's terrible X. Everybody understand how I labeled those? Alright. So first thing we're usually going to start with is that the torques clockwise equal the torques counterclockwise. So we're going to say the summation of all the moments or all the torques, I'm going to use torques, has to equal 0. So we want to choose a pivot point. Remember, we want to choose a pivot point where we have a lot of forces, so we eliminate them. Yep, so we'll choose our pivot point at A. So what forces are going to be causing this to rotate that aren't at A? F1. So is F1 going to be turning it clockwise or counterclockwise? If it's pivot clockwise. Everybody understand why that's clockwise? So we'll make that positive. So we'll say F1 times its distance from the pivot point. What about, what's another force? FCX. Is that going clockwise or counterclockwise? Counter. So we're going to subtract that. So we'll say minus FCX times its distance. And those have to equal 0. So those are all our forces that aren't at that pivot point. So we'll substitute in here. We get F1 is 1350. And how far is it from the pivot point? Remember, it's the perpendicular distance to get as close to the pivot point as possible. You do not have to do any Pythagorean theorem. So all it's going to be is going to be that distance right there. We want to go perpendicular 12. So we're going to go perpendicular to the force and get as close to the pivot point as possible. Does everybody see that? So we can't get any closer than that, so we go, it's 12 meters, or 12 feet. And then minus FCX is what we're looking for here. And what's its distance from the pivot point? 10. That equals 0. So you guys get your calculators out and solve for that. So the answer was 1,620. Is that right? Alright, so that's one of our answers, FCX. Everybody understand that? Now we need to find FAY and FAX. So we're going to do summation of forces in the y direction has to equal 0. What are the forces we have acting in the y direction? We have FAY. Is FAY going to be positive or negative? Positive because it's up. And what about F1, positive or negative? So minus F1 equals 0. So we get FAY minus 1350 equals 0. So FAY equals 1350 pounds. So that's our second one. That makes sense, everybody? All right. And because we got that positive, we mean we chose the right direction for it, so it's pointing up. So now we've got summation of forces in the x direction has to equal 0. And so what are our forces in the x direction? FCX and FAX. Is FAX going to be positive or negative since it's pointing left? Negative. So minus FAX equals 0. So we get 1620 pounds minus FAX equals 0. FAX equals 1620 pounds. That means because we got all positives for those, that means we guessed the right directions on them. If we got negative, we'd have to switch the arrow. Does that make sense, everybody? And any questions on that one? So this one is going to work out kind of similar. What forces do we need to draw here?
The fixed force is left and up.
All right, so you're going to say FAX and FAY. What other force do we have here?
We got the roller joint.
The roller joint.
It's going right.
Right? So we'll say FDX. Well, guess that's going to the right. And again, if we get the wrong answer for any of these, we're going to just flip the arrow. All right. So almost always the first step of this is to choose a pivot point and do the torques or moments clockwise and counterclockwise. What do you want to choose for our pivot point? A. A is another good one to choose here again. All right. So we'll choose that as our pivot point. So we're going to have summation of torques equals 0. So what things are going to be causing torques?
F1, F2,
And
FDX.
yep. So is the torque from F1 going to be positive or negative?
Negative.
Is it clockwise or counterclockwise?
Yeah, it's positive.
Positive. So we'll say positive F1 times its distance. What about F2? Positive or negative? Positive, so plus F2 times its distance.
Minus FDX.
And minus FDX times its distance. All right, any questions on how we get the positives or negatives there? It's all in relation to the pivot point. So if the force is causing it to go clockwise, it's positive. If it's forcing it to go counterclockwise, it's negative. All right, any other questions? So I substitute in what we know. F1 is 550. What's F1's distance from the pivot point going to be?
F1,
15. Everybody understand how we got 15? It's x1 plus x2 plus f2, which is 1300. What's its distance from the pivot point? Eight feet. Any questions on how we got the 8 feet there? Minus FDX is what we're trying to find. Times, what's FDX's distance from the pivot point? 6. Alright, any questions on how we got those numbers or anything? Alright, well, you guys try figuring that out. So we got FDX equals 3,108. We'll just stick with that. Alright, any questions on that one? Alright, what's our next step going to be? Forces in the y direction. Got summation of forces y equals 0. What are our forces in the y direction?
F1, F2.
FAY, is that going to be positive or negative? Positive. What about F1 and F2? Negatives because they're pointing down. So minus F1 minus F2 equals 0. So FAY equals, FAY minus 550 minus F2 is 1300 equals 0. So what's FAY equal? 1850. All right. Any questions about that one? All right. And what's our last step?
Finding the x.
Measure force in the x direction equals 0. So what are our two forces in the x direction?
FAX and FDX.
FAX positive or negative? Negative FAX. FDX positive or negative? Positive equals 0. So we get negative FAX plus 3108 0. So FAX equals 3108 pounds. Alright, and again that's positive, and everything was positive, so we don't need to change any of our arrows. Alright, any questions on this one? Do you guys want to do the last one on your own or together?
Together. On our own. Together. On our own. Together. On our own.
Okay, this one's a little different, but we're still going to be dealing with the same kind of forces. What forces do we want to draw in?
Fixed point.
Fixed point. So what do you think it's doing at A? Is it going up or down? It can only be going up or down. You guys want to? You're going to say FAY up or down? Up. And what about FAX? Right. And what about FCY? Up or down? Up. Alright. So what do you think we want to choose as our pivot point for our A? So we'll choose that as our pivot point. Alright, so we're going to say sum of the torques equals 0. What torques so what's the torque that's causing it to rotate? F2. Is F2 clockwise or counterclockwise? So we're going to say F2 times its distance. What other force causing it to rotate? F1. Is F1 causing it to go clockwise or counterclockwise? Counterclockwise. So F1, so we're going to subtract that. F1 times its distance. And what's our last force? Clockwise or counterclockwise? Counter, so it's going to be minus FCY times its distance equals 0. Any questions on those? Okay, we got counterclockwise and clockwise. Alright, we sub our numbers in, we get 900 times what's F2's distance from the pivot point? 8 feet. What's it? Go ahead.
For FAX and FAY, how do you know it's going up and how do you know it's going to the right?
We don't. We just guess.
Okay.
And if we get it wrong, we'll get a negative answer, and then we flip the arrow. Alright. Here's a good question. So F1 is 1,200 pounds. And what's F1's distance from the pivot point? It's got to be perpendicular to the force. 6. So it's got to be, we got to go perpendicular and get as close as possible. So that distance right there is y1, so that's 6 feet. Does that make sense, everybody? Alright. Minus FCY times, what's FCY's distance from the pivot point? 19. Ah. I don't know what happened to that line there. There we go. Alright. So what does FCY end up equaling? it 0?
Yeah.
All right. So the upward force in FCY equals 0. Is that what it worked out to?
Yeah.
All right. All right. That means that all the forces are acting on A over here. But that'll help us later on. Okay. So the summation of forces in the y direction equals 0. What forces do we have in the y direction? We have F2 and FCY. And both FAY and FCY are going to be added. So plus FAY plus FCY. So, F2 negative 900 plus FAY and plus 0 for FCY. So FAY ends up equaling 900 pounds. Any questions on the y direction part there? And now we got summation of forces in the x direction equals 0. What are our forces in the x direction? FAX and F1. And FAX is positive, F1 is negative. So we get FAX minus 1200. So FAX equals 1200. All right, any questions on that one? It is possible to get 0 for any of these. Sam?
How did you get 6 for the distance
For
for F1?
F1, so you got to remember it's perpendicular to the force. So if we go perpendicular to F1, the closest we can get is after we go 6 feet.